20 years ago, an aid worker saved a boy's life in a war-torn village, forging an unspoken bond that would change both their lives forever. But now, the boy is a renowned neurologist, and the time has come for him to repay the man who gave him a second chance at life. What happens when the boy, now a doctor, returns to help the man who saved him? This powerful story of compassion, redemption, and the deep ties that bind will leave you questioning the true meaning of giving and receiving. Will the past heal the present, or will it unravel the future they've both worked so hard to rebuild? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Stanley's living room, painting the worn furniture in shades of amber and gold. Stanley sat in his favorite armchair by the window, his weathered hands resting on the armrests as he gazed out at the quiet street below. At 55, his face carried the lines of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. His mind drifted back 20 years to a day that changed not just his life, but the life of a young boy named Ethan. The memories came rushing back, clear as photographs. The air had been thick with dust and smoke in that small village. Buildings crumbled around them, and the sound of distant explosions echoed through the streets. Stanley had been making his rounds as an aid worker when he heard the cry, a sound that still haunted his dreams. In his mind's eye, he could see it all again. Young Ethan, no more than 12, lay trapped beneath fallen debris. Blood trickled from a head wound, and his small face was twisted in pain and fear. Other aid workers had deemed the area too dangerous, but Stanley couldn't walk away. "Hold on, son," he had said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I'm going to get you out of here." The memory was so vivid, the way his hands shook as he carefully moved the debris, the way Ethan's eyes locked onto his, filled with trust and desperation. Stanley had worked quickly, using his medical training to assess the injuries. A serious head trauma, but treatable if they could get him to safety in time. More explosions had rocked the ground as Stanley carried the boy through the rubble-strewn streets. Ethan's small fingers had gripped Stanley's shirt so tightly, anchoring himself to his rescuer. They hadn't exchanged many words, there hadn't been time, but in those moments a connection formed that transcended language. Stanley remembered the makeshift medical tent, the frantic work to stabilize Ethan's condition. He could still feel the relief that flooded through him when the boy's vital signs finally stabilized. It was one of his proudest moments as an aid worker, a clear reminder of why he had chosen this path. Back in the present, Stanley shifted in his chair, his joints protesting the movement. His eyes fell on the framed photograph on the side table. Anne, his wife, smiling at the camera during happier times. Her eyes sparkled with the same compassion that had drawn them together, the same drive to help others that had defined their life together. With a heavy sigh, Stanley reached out and picked up the photograph. His thumb traced the edge of the frame, remembering how Anne had supported his humanitarian work, how she had shared his dedication to making the world a better place. Now she was gone, and the purpose that had once filled his life seemed to have faded with her. He placed the photograph back on the table, his movements gentle and deliberate. The setting sun caught the glass of the frame, creating a soft glow around Anne's face. Stanley sat back in his chair, surrounded by the gathering shadows of evening, a man caught between the weight of his past and the emptiness of his present. On a sunny afternoon, Stanley sat in the kitchen at his worn wooden table streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on Stanley's worn wooden table. He sat there, holding an envelope in his trembling hands. The return address caught his eye. Dr. Ethan Matthews, Chief of Neurology. His heart skipped a beat as he carefully opened the letter. The paper felt crisp between his fingers as he unfolded it. Stanley's eyes moved across the neat handwriting, his breath catching in his throat. "Dear Mr. Stanley," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "You may not remember me, but 20 years ago, you saved my life in a war-torn village. I was the 12-year-old boy with the head injury." Stanley paused, pressing his palm flat against the table to steady himself. Of course he remembered. How could he forget? "Your courage and kindness that day changed the course of my life forever," he continued reading, his voice growing thick with emotion. "I became a doctor because of you. specifically a neurologist. I wanted to help others the way you helped me." A small sound escaped Stanley's throat, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He took a moment to compose himself before reading on. "It has taken me years to find you. I've searched databases, contacted aid organizations, and finally tracked you down through an old mission roster. I want you to know that not a day goes by when I don't think about what you did for me." Stanley's eyes grew misty as he read about Ethan's accomplishments. His medical school graduation, his residency, his current position as head of a prestigious neurology department. Pride swelled in his chest, though he felt strange taking any credit for the man Ethan had become. "I would be honored if we could meet," the letter continued. "I understand if you're not comfortable with this request, but I've spent 20 years wanting to thank you properly." Stanley lowered the letter, his hands shaking more than before. He glanced around his kitchen, at the unwashed coffee mug in the sink, the stack of unopened mail, the calendar showing nothing but blank squares. His life now was so different from the one he'd led when he'd saved Ethan. After a long moment, he picked up the letter again, reading through it one more time. Each word seemed to carry the weight of the years between then and now, of all that had changed, of all that had been lost. Setting the letter down carefully on the table, Stanley turned to look out the window. The neighbors' children were playing in their yard, their laughter floating through the glass. He watched them, considering Ethan's request. Part of him wanted to leave the past in the past, to let sleeping dogs lie. But another part, the part that remembered the frightened boy's eyes looking up at him with trust, wanted to see how that boy had grown up. With a deep breath, Stanley reached for a pen and paper. He would write back to Ethan. He needed to know how the story had turned out. A few days had passed since he wrote to Ethan. One morning, Stanley retrieved another envelope from his mailbox. His heart quickened when he recognized Ethan's distinctive handwriting. Settling into his worn armchair, he opened the letter with careful fingers. "Dear Mr. Stanley," the letter began, "thank you for your response. I can't express how much it means to me that you remember that day. I would be honored if you would meet me in person next week. There's so much I want to share with you about how that moment changed my life." Stanley's eyes moved across the pages as Ethan detailed his current life. He had become one of the country's leading neurologists, with a success rate that made headlines in medical journals. The letter spoke of innovative surgical techniques and breakthrough treatments that had saved countless lives. The scene shifted to Ethan's office at the prestigious medical center where he worked. Morning light filtered through tall windows as he studied brain scans spread across his desk. His white coat hung crisp and neat on a nearby hook, his name and titles embroidered in blue. Dr. Ethan Matthews, Chief of Neurology. A knock at his door interrupted his concentration. "Dr. Matthews," his assistant called. "Your next patient is ready." Ethan smiled warmly at the elderly woman who entered his office, her hands trembling slightly from her condition. "Mrs. Chen, please have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. As he explained her diagnosis and treatment plan, his mind briefly flickered to that day 20 years ago when Stanley had shown him what true compassion looked like. Later that afternoon, between consultations, Ethan paused at his desk. His fingers traced the edge of a framed article from a medical journal, highlighting his groundbreaking work in treating rare neurological disorders. The headline read, "Dr. Matthews' revolutionary approach saves lives." He thought about how each success, each breakthrough could be traced back to that pivotal moment when Stanley had saved him. The determination in Stanley's eyes, the steady hands that had worked to keep him alive, these memories had guided Ethan through medical school, through his residency, through every challenging case. Back in Stanley's living room, the elderly man placed the letter on his side table. Pride swelled in his chest at reading about Ethan's achievements, but nervousness fluttered in his stomach at the thought of meeting him. He picked up the small family photo from the table, studying his younger self in his aid worker uniform. The man in that photo seemed so different from who he was now. Stanley ran his fingers through his gray hair, wondering what Ethan would think of him after all these years. Would he measure up to the hero Ethan remembered? His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his calendar to mark the date of their meeting. After days of anticipation, the much-awaited day had arrived. The doorbell chimed through Stanley's quiet house on a peaceful autumn afternoon, breaking the heavy silence that had become his constant companion. Stanley shuffled to the door, his movements slow and deliberate, each step betraying the weariness that seemed to cling to him like a shadow. When he opened it, Ethan stood there looking polished in his tailored charcoal suit and crisp white shirt. "Mr. Stanley," Ethan said warmly, extending his hand, his eyes bright with recognition. It's wonderful to see you again. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Stanley's grip was weak as they shook hands, nothing like the strong, sure touch Ethan remembered from years ago. The changes in Stanley's appearance hit Ethan hard. The once robust aid worker now looked thin and tired, with deep lines etched around his eyes and silver threading through his unkempt hair. "Please come in," Stanley said softly, stepping aside and gesturing toward the living room with a slight tremor in his hand. In the living room, they settled into worn armchairs, the fabric threadbare in places from years of use. Family photos lined the walls in simple wooden frames, and Ethan's gaze was drawn to a prominent picture of Stanley with a smiling woman, his late wife. In the photo, they both radiated happiness, their arms wrapped around each other against a backdrop of mountains. "Anne," Stanley said, following Ethan's gaze, his voice thick with emotion. "She passed 3 years ago. We were on a mission together when—" His voice cracked slightly, and he paused to collect himself. "There was a bombing. I wasn't there when it happened. I was helping at another site just 2 miles away." Ethan leaned forward, his heart aching at the raw pain in Stanley's voice. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly, wishing he had better words to offer. "The house feels empty now," Stanley continued, his hands fidgeting restlessly in his lap, twisting the gold wedding band he still wore. "I don't do aid work anymore. Can't bring myself to go back after—" He trailed off, looking out the window at the maple tree in the yard, its leaves starting to turn golden. As the afternoon light dimmed and shadows lengthened across the floor, Stanley shared more about his struggles, the loneliness that seemed to echo through every room, the crushing guilt he carried about Anne, wondering if things might have been different if he'd stayed by her side, his declining health that made even simple tasks challenging, though he stubbornly refused to seek help. Ethan listened intently, trying to reconcile this vulnerable man with the hero from his memories. "Sometimes I wonder what purpose I have left," Stanley admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. Ethan wanted to offer comfort but found himself at a loss for words. How could he help the man who had once been so strong, so decisive? The man who had saved his life with unwavering determination was now drowning in his own sorrow, and the role reversal felt both poignant and painful. As evening approached and the room grew dim, Ethan stood to leave. "I'd like to visit again," he said firmly, placing a gentle hand on Stanley's bony shoulder. "If that's all right with you? Perhaps next week?" Stanley nodded, a small smile touching his lips, the first genuine expression Ethan had seen all afternoon. "I'd like that." Walking to his car in the growing dusk, Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of how he could help Stanley. The man who had given him a second chance at life needed help himself now, and Ethan was determined to find a way to provide it, to somehow repay the debt he'd carried all these years. The weight of that responsibility settled around his shoulders as he drove away, already planning his next visit. The evening sun cast long shadows across Stanley's living room as he and Ethan sat with their cups of tea. Steam rose in gentle wisps between them, and Stanley stared into his cup, his weathered hands wrapped around its warmth. After a long silence, he cleared his throat. "You know, I've never really talked about Anne," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not like this." Ethan leaned forward slightly, giving Stanley his full attention. The older man's eyes grew distant as memories flooded back. "We were in Sudan," Stanley continued. "There was this refugee camp that needed medical supplies. Anne, she was always so dedicated. She insisted on staying even when things got dangerous." His mind drifted back to that day, the oppressive heat, the dust that seemed to coat everything, the constant distant sound of artillery fire. In his memory, Anne stood before him, her blonde hair tucked beneath a faded blue bandana, her face determined despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. "I had been working for 36 hours straight," Stanley's voice cracked. "She made me go back to camp to rest, said she'd finish up the supply distribution." He set his tea down, his hands trembling. "That was the last time I saw her alive." The scene played out in his mind, the deafening explosion that shook the ground, the black smoke rising in the distance, the horrible knowledge that Anne had been there. His chest tightened at the memory. "I should have stayed with her," he whispered. "I was supposed to protect her. That's what husbands do, right? But I wasn't there when she needed me most." Ethan sat quietly, his own tea forgotten as he watched tears gather in Stanley's eyes. "We had so many close calls before," Stanley continued. "In Kosovo, in Syria, we always made it through together. But that one time I wasn't there." He shook his head, unable to continue. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as Stanley gathered himself. "You know what the worst part is? Our last conversation was about whether we should order more antibiotics or pain medication. Such a mundane thing, if I'd known. Sometimes I wonder if any of it made a difference," he added after a moment. "All those years in war zones, all the people we tried to help. And in the end, we couldn't even keep each other safe." The room grew quiet as the last rays of sunlight faded. Stanley exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his confession had physically drained him. Ethan reached out and placed a gentle hand on Stanley's shoulder. Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding, one man carrying the burden of survival, the other the weight of loss. The doorbell's chime echoed through the quiet house, startling both men. Stanley rose slowly from his chair, his movements careful and deliberate. The front door opened, and Maya stepped inside, her presence immediately bringing warmth to the room. She wore simple jeans and a light sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. "Dad?" she called out, then paused as she noticed Ethan standing in the living room. Her eyes, kind and curious, moved between the two men. "Maya, this is Ethan," Stanley said softly. "The young man I told you about. From Sudan." Recognition flickered across Maya's face. "Oh, the doctor." She stepped forward, extending her hand with a genuine smile. "Dad's mentioned you. It's wonderful to finally meet you." Ethan shook her hand, struck by the quiet confidence in her grip. "The pleasure's mine," he replied, finding himself immediately at ease in her presence. They moved to the kitchen, where Maya insisted on preparing a simple dinner for everyone. The kitchen soon filled with the aroma of heating soup and fresh bread. As they settled around the old wooden table, Maya turned to Ethan. "How are you finding Dad?" she asked, passing him a bowl. "I hope he's been opening up a bit more." "We've had some good conversations," Ethan replied, watching as she attended to her father with practiced care. "Maya's been my anchor these past few years," Stanley said quietly, his eyes full of pride. "I work from home," Maya explained, settling into her chair. "Freelance writing mostly. It allows me to be here when Dad needs me." Her voice carried no hint of complaint, though Ethan could sense the weight of responsibility she carried. As they ate, Maya shared stories about growing up, her eyes lighting up as she recalled happier times. "Mom used to make this soup whenever she was home between missions," she said, stirring her spoon thoughtfully. "She'd say a good meal could heal almost anything." Ethan found himself drawn to Maya's quiet strength, the way she balanced caring for her father while maintaining her own identity. She spoke with both humor and depth, and he noticed how she seemed to anticipate her father's needs before he expressed them. When dinner was finished, Maya stood and began clearing the dishes. "It's such a beautiful evening," she observed, glancing out the window. "Would anyone like to take a walk in the garden? The roses are blooming." "I'd like that," Ethan replied, perhaps too quickly. Stanley remained seated, watching as Maya and Ethan moved toward the back door. Through the kitchen window, he observed them stepping into the evening air, their figures silhouetted against the setting sun. A knowing look crossed his tired face as he watched them walk side by side into the garden. The morning sun cast long shadows across Stanley's front porch as he and Ethan sat in comfortable wicker chairs, sharing stories of their time in humanitarian work. The gentle crunch of gravel under their feet and the distant chirping of birds provided a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. The screen door creaked open, and Maya emerged carrying a tray with 3 steaming mugs of coffee, careful not to spill a drop. "I thought you both could use this," she said, carefully distributing the cups, the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air around them. Ethan watched as she settled into a chair between them, noting how she automatically angled herself to keep an eye on her father, her posture both protective and natural. "How do you manage it all?" he asked gently, genuine concern in his voice. "Working from home and taking care of everything here?" Maya wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, the warmth seeping into her fingers as she considered the question. "Some days are harder than others," she admitted, her shoulders lifting slightly. "The freelance writing helps. I can set my own schedule, work when Dad's resting." Her voice softened, carrying a weight of emotion. "But watching him struggle? That's the hardest part." Later that afternoon, they moved to the porch swing, its gentle creaking providing a rhythm to their conversation. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine from the garden, where butterflies danced among the flowers. "After Mom died," Maya continued, her eyes distant, focusing on something far beyond the garden, "I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. I had a job offer in Seattle, editorial position at a magazine. But..." She glanced at her father, who sat quietly beside her, his face lined with both grief and love. "Some choices make themselves." Stanley reached for his daughter's hand, his weathered fingers closing gently over hers. "You shouldn't have given up so much," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't giving up, Dad," Maya replied firmly, squeezing his hand. "It was choosing what mattered most." Ethan observed their interaction, struck by the depth of their bond. He saw the quiet strength in Maya's shoulders, the grace with which she carried her responsibilities. Her dedication moved him deeply, stirring something in his heart he hadn't expected, a warmth that spread through his chest. "There are some treatments we could consider," Ethan offered carefully, leaning forward in his chair. "Not just for physical symptoms, but for emotional well-being too. Support groups for both of you, perhaps. Places where you can connect with others who understand what you're going through." Maya's eyes met his, filled with gratitude for his understanding, a slight sheen of tears making them bright. "That would be helpful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I feel like I'm navigating this alone." They sat together as the afternoon faded, sharing comfortable silences between conversations, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn. When evening approached, painting the sky in soft pinks and purples, Ethan stood to leave. Maya walked with him to the front door, their steps slow and matched, neither seeming eager to end the moment. At the threshold, they paused, looking at each other. No words were needed. Something deeper than friendship had begun to form between them, born of shared concern and growing admiration. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, the air between them charged with unspoken understanding, before Ethan turned to leave, carrying with him the warmth of the afternoon and the memory of Maya's grateful smile. The following afternoon, Ethan knocked on Stanley's front door, his heart beating a little faster than usual. His fingers drummed nervously against his thigh as he waited. Stanley opened it with a warm smile, and Maya appeared behind him, her face brightening at the sight of their visitor, her dark hair catching the afternoon light. Come in," Stanley said, stepping aside to welcome him into the cozy home. They settled in the living room, sharing casual conversation about the weather and neighborhood happenings. Maya mentioned the new flower shop that had opened down the street, while Stanley commented on the unseasonably mild temperatures. After a few minutes, Maya excused herself to prepare tea, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor as she disappeared into the kitchen. The sunlight was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the living room floor and highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Maya returned, But instead of joining them immediately, she caught Ethan's eye and gestured for him to join her in the kitchen, her expression serious. "There's something you should know," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, glancing toward the living room to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Dad's condition. It's not just physical." She twisted a dish towel in her hands, her knuckles growing white with tension. "Ever since Mom died, he's been battling depression. He won't see anyone about it, won't take any medication. He says it would dishonor Mom's memory somehow." Ethan leaned against the counter, processing this new information, his medical training immediately kicking in. "Has he always refused help?" "Always," Maya nodded, her eyes growing misty behind her glasses. "It's like he thinks he doesn't deserve to get better. Like suffering is his way of staying connected to Mom." She wiped quickly at her eyes with trembling fingers. "I've tried everything, but he just withdraws more and more into himself." "This explains a lot," Ethan said softly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The physical symptoms, his reluctance to engage in treatment discussions. It all makes more sense now. "I don't know what to do anymore," Maya admitted, her voice cracking slightly as she wrapped her arms around herself. "Sometimes I feel like I'm losing him piece by piece, watching him fade away right in front of me." Ethan stepped closer, close enough to smell her light floral perfume, his voice gentle but firm. "We'll figure this out together, Maya. Depression is complex, but there are ways to help him. It won't be easy, but you're not alone in this anymore, I promise you that." Maya looked up at him gratefully, relief washing over her face and softening her worried features. "Thank you," she whispered. "Just having someone else understand means so much." They returned to the living room with the tea tray, finding Stanley gazing out the window, lost in thought, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. As they settled into their seats, the leather cushions creaking softly, Ethan caught Maya's eye. Their shared look spoke volumes, a silent agreement to work together, to help Stanley find his way back to the light. The three sat quietly, sipping their tea as the evening settled around them. Through the window, the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in soft purples and pinks, a peaceful backdrop to their unspoken understanding. The gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner marked the passing moments as they sat together, each lost in their own thoughts about the path that lay ahead. The next afternoon, in Stanley's living room, Ethan leaned forward in his chair, his expression earnest and concerned. "There are treatments we could try, Stanley. Options that could help you feel better." Stanley shook his head, his shoulders slumped. "What's the point?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Ever since Anne died, I've lost my way, my purpose." His hands trembled slightly as he picked up a framed photo of his wife from the side table. "You still have so much to offer," Ethan said gently. "Your experience, your compassion." "No." Stanley's voice cracked. "Without Anne, without my work, I'm just taking up space here." As Stanley spoke, memories flooded back, images of his younger self working tirelessly in refugee camps, treating wounds, delivering supplies to those in desperate need. The satisfaction of making a real difference in people's lives had filled him with purpose back then. "I used to know exactly who I was," Stanley continued, his eyes distant. "Every morning, I woke up knowing I could help someone, whether it was treating injuries in the field or supporting Anne in her projects." He trailed off, swallowing hard. "Now, I'm just here." Ethan tried again. "There's a new treatment protocol that's shown promising results." "Stop!" Stanley's voice grew defensive. "I don't want it. I don't deserve it. The world doesn't need another broken old man taking up resources." "That's not true," Ethan countered patiently. "Your daughter needs you. The people who care about you." "Maya would be better off without having to worry about me," Stanley interrupted, turning to stare out the window. "I've given what I had to give. That chapter is closed now." Ethan watched him, recognizing that Stanley's resistance wasn't mere stubbornness. It was a manifestation of deep, unresolved grief. He searched for the right words, but everything felt inadequate against the weight of Stanley's pain. "At least consider it," Ethan tried one last time. "For Maya's sake." Stanley remained silent, his gaze fixed on something distant beyond the window. The tension in the room grew thick and heavy. Finally, Ethan stood up, his frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said softly. Stanley didn't respond or turn around, remaining motionless in his chair, lost in the prison of his own sorrow. The following morning, Ethan stepped into Stanley's house. He found Maya at the stove, her movements slower and more deliberate than usual as she prepared breakfast. The kitchen smelled of coffee and toast, but there was a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the morning meal. "Good morning," Ethan said softly, noting the tension in Maya's shoulders. She turned, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning, Ethan. Coffee?" As she poured him a cup, her hands trembled slightly. They sat at the kitchen table, and Maya pushed eggs around her plate, clearly wrestling with something on her mind. "There's something you need to know about Dad," she finally said, setting her fork down. "Something that explains why he's been so resistant to help." Ethan leaned forward, giving her his full attention. "It's not just his physical health," Maya continued, her voice catching. "He's been battling depression ever since Mom died. He doesn't think he deserves to live." The kitchen grew quiet except for the gentle ticking of the wall clock. Maya's eyes grew distant as she recalled darker days. "The funeral was the beginning," she said softly. "After we buried Mom, it was like Dad buried himself too." In her mind's eye, she saw the funeral. Stanley standing stone-faced by the grave, refusing to cry, refusing to accept condolences. The days that followed were worse. Empty rooms, unanswered calls, meals left untouched. "I tried everything," Maya said, her voice breaking. "I begged him to see a therapist, to talk to someone, but he just pushed me away. Instead, he threw himself into helping others, ignoring his own pain. He thinks because he wasn't there when Mom died and when that bomb went off, he failed her somehow." Tears welled in Maya's eyes. He was supposed to be with her that day, but he'd been sent back to camp to rest. He's never forgiven himself for that. He thinks he should have died instead of her. Ethan reached across the table, gently squeezing her hand. "I've watched him fade away," Maya whispered. "Every day he retreats further into himself. He won't face his grief, won't acknowledge how much pain he's in." She looked up at Ethan, her eyes pleading. "He might listen to you. He respects you. Please, could you try to help him? Not just as a doctor, but as someone who understands loss." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Maya's words settling between them. Ethan nodded slowly, his expression determined. "I'll help him," he promised. "We'll find a way to reach him." Maya's grateful smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds, though her eyes remained worried. They sat together at the kitchen table, their breakfast forgotten, united in their concern for the man who had saved Ethan's life so many years ago. Late that afternoon, Stanley and Ethan were seated in the living room. Today felt different. There was no medical bag at his feet, no charts to review. Instead, he leaned forward with gentle determination in his eyes. "Stanley," Ethan began softly, "I want to talk about Anne." Stanley's shoulders stiffened at the mention of his wife's name. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, but Ethan continued. "Before I became a doctor, I lost someone too, my sister." Ethan's voice grew quiet. "For years I blamed myself. I thought if I'd been smarter, faster, better, maybe I could have saved her." Stanley's eyes flickered toward Ethan, a crack appearing in his usually stoic expression. "I know it's not the same as losing Anne," Ethan acknowledged, "but I understand what it's like to carry that weight." Images flooded Stanley's mind. Anne in her white aid worker uniform, laughing as they packed medical supplies together. Her determined face as she treated patients in makeshift clinics. Her last smile before he left for camp that fateful day. "She was everything," Stanley whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "We were supposed to help people together, but I wasn't there when—" His words trailed off. "It's okay to talk about her," Ethan encouraged gently. "It's okay to miss her." Something broke inside Stanley. Years of carefully constructed walls began to crumble. I've been pretending I'm fine, he admitted, his hands trembling. Telling Maya I'm okay, telling myself I'm okay, but I'm not. I haven't been since that day. You don't have to carry this alone anymore, Ethan said softly. Stanley's eyes filled with tears. I see her everywhere. In every room of this house, in every medical supply kit, in every sunset. And each time I remember that I wasn't there. I should have been there. Anne wouldn't want you to punish yourself like this, Ethan said. She'd want you to heal. Stanley's breath caught in his throat. I don't know how to heal without her, he confessed. She was always the one who knew what to do, how to help others. Now I'm lost. It starts with allowing yourself to feel the pain you've been pushing away, Ethan explained, and accepting that you don't have to face it alone. For the first time in years, Stanley let his tears fall freely. His shoulders shook as he released some of the grief he'd held inside for so long. When his tears subsided, Ethan spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. There are people who can help you work through this. Professional therapists who specialize in grief counseling. Stanley was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. The room felt lighter somehow, as if a heavy cloud had begun to lift. Stanley's breathing was easier, his posture less rigid. It was a small change, but in that moment, it meant everything. Early next morning, Ethan's car pulled into Stanley's driveway. Maya greeted him at the door, her face a mixture of worry and hope. Is he ready? Ethan asked softly. Maya nodded. As ready as he'll ever be. They found Stanley sitting in his usual armchair, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. The visiting doctor, Dr. Peterson, arrived shortly after, carrying his medical bag. Good morning, Mr. Thompson, Dr. Peterson said warmly, setting up his equipment in the living room. Let's see how you're doing. The examination was thorough but gentle. Dr. Peterson checked Stanley's reflexes, conducted cognitive tests, and reviewed his symptoms. Throughout the process, Maya stood by the doorway, her hands clasped tightly together while Ethan maintained a professional demeanor despite his growing concern. Finally, Dr. Peterson sat down across from Stanley. Mr. Thompson, I've completed my assessment. You have a progressive neurological condition called multiple system atrophy. While it's not immediately life-threatening, it will require ongoing management. Stanley's face remained impassive, but his hands gripped the chair arms tighter. The condition affects multiple parts of your nervous system, Dr. Peterson continued. We can manage the symptoms with medication, but I need to be honest. There isn't a cure. The progression varies from person to person, but it will impact your daily activities over time. Ethan watched Stanley carefully as the doctor explained the treatment plan, the medications, and the lifestyle changes needed. There was resignation in Stanley's eyes, but also something else. A tiny spark of determination that hadn't been there before. After Dr. Peterson left, silence filled the room. Ethan moved to sit beside Stanley, while Maya quietly excused herself to make tea. What are you thinking? Ethan asked gently. Stanley took a deep breath. I suppose I can't ignore it anymore, can I? No, Ethan replied. But you don't have to face it alone. Stanley looked down at the prescription papers in his hands. It's strange, he said quietly. All these years helping others, and now it's time to let others help you, Ethan finished. Stanley nodded slowly, the papers crinkling slightly in his grip. Though his shoulders still carried tension, there was a subtle shift in his posture, as if some of the weight he'd been carrying had begun to lift. The medication will help, Ethan assured him, but it's just one part of the journey. I know, Stanley replied, and for the first time that morning, his voice carried a note of quiet resolve. The following morning, Ethan carefully arranged cushions and exercise equipment. He had arrived early, determined to make Stanley's first day of therapy as comfortable as possible. Good morning, Stanley, Ethan said warmly, setting down his medical bag. How are you feeling today? Stanley sat in his usual chair, eyeing the equipment with obvious distrust. I've been better." "We'll take it slow," Ethan assured him, laying out the prescribed medications on the coffee table. "These will help manage your symptoms, but we need to combine them with some gentle exercises." Stanley's jaw tightened. "I don't see the point." "Every journey starts with small steps," Ethan replied patiently. He helped Stanley move to his bedroom, where he had set up a more private space for their session. The bedroom was bathed in soft morning light. Ethan had arranged some basic exercise equipment, resistance bands, small weights, and balance aids. Stanley looked at them as if they were foreign objects. "Let's start with some simple stretches," Ethan suggested, demonstrating a gentle arm movement. Stanley mimicked the motion reluctantly, his joints stiff and uncooperative. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Just focus on the movement," Ethan encouraged, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Nothing more." As they progressed through the exercises, Stanley's movements were hesitant and jerky. His face showed frustration with each attempt, but Ethan remained steadfast, offering quiet encouragement without pushing too hard. During their breaks, Stanley would fall into contemplative silences, his mind clearly drifting to memories of his more active days. Ethan respected these moments, staying close but allowing Stanley the space to process his emotions. By evening, Stanley was visibly exhausted. His movements had become slower, but he had completed each exercise Ethan suggested, albeit with constant resistance. "That's enough for today," Ethan said, helping Stanley back to his living room chair. "You did well." Stanley sank into the chair, fatigue evident in every line of his body. "If you say so." "I'll be back tomorrow," Ethan said, gathering his things. "Same time?" Stanley gave a non-committal grunt, already turning to gaze out the window. As Ethan prepared to leave, he watched Stanley's reflection in the window, a man wrestling with his own thoughts, trying to make peace with this new chapter in his life. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Stanley's kitchen, as Maya and Ethan sat at the wooden table, their coffee cups steaming between them. Maya's laugh filled the room as Ethan shared a story about one of his more peculiar patients. "I can't believe he actually tried to diagnose himself using only cat videos from the internet," Maya said, shaking her head with amusement. "Neither could I," Ethan replied, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "But your father's doing much better than my internet-savvy patient. I noticed he's actually following the exercise routine now." Maya's expression softened. "Thank you for that. I haven't seen him this engaged in years. It means everything to see him trying again." They moved to the backyard, where the late afternoon light painted everything in golden hues. The old wooden bench creaked as they sat down, surrounded by Maya's carefully tended garden. "I remember when Mom used to garden here," Maya said quietly, running her hand along the weathered wood. "She would spend hours out here telling me about each plant's personality. After she died, I couldn't bear to let it go wild. It felt like keeping a piece of her alive." Ethan listened intently as Maya described the day they received the news about her mother's death. Her voice trembled slightly as she recalled how quickly everything changed. "Dad just shut down. And suddenly I wasn't just his daughter anymore. I became his caretaker, his anchor. Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water." "You've carried so much," Ethan said softly, his hand resting near hers on the bench. Maya looked at the flowering bushes her mother had planted years ago. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, if I'm strong enough to keep going." "Maya," Ethan turned to face her, his expression earnest. "What you've done for your father, it takes incredible strength. Not everyone could handle it with such grace." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. It helps having someone else understand. Someone who sees. The garden grew quiet as they sat together, watching the sun's rays filter through the leaves. Maya's shoulder brushed against Ethan's, and neither moved away. The evening air was filled with the gentle humming of bees and the distant sound of wind chimes. "Thank you," Maya said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For listening, for understanding, for helping Dad." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with admiration and something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. The moment stretched between them, comfortable and full of unspoken understanding. The evening shadows lengthened across Stanley's living room as Maya settled onto the couch beside her father. The old lamp cast a warm, gentle glow across their faces, and the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock filled the comfortable silence between them. Maya's hands fidgeted in her lap as she gathered her courage. "Dad," she began softly, "there's something I need to talk to you about." Stanley turned to face her, his weathered features softening at the nervousness in her voice. Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's about Ethan," she continued. "Over these past few weeks, I've grown to care for him, more than I expected to." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke the words she'd been holding back. Stanley remained quiet, his expression unreadable as he listened. Maya pressed on, her words coming faster now. "After Mom died, I thought I'd closed that part of my heart forever. I was so focused on taking care of you, on keeping everything together, that I never imagined—" She paused, collecting her thoughts. "But with Ethan, it's different. He makes me feel safe, understood." Stanley's silence made her heart race, but when she looked up, she saw no disapproval in his eyes. Instead, he wore a thoughtful expression, his gaze steady and calm. "I know it might seem sudden," Maya added quickly. "And I worried about telling you because of your mother," Stanley finished quietly. Maya nodded, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "Yes, and because of everything we've been through." Stanley shifted in his chair, taking a moment before speaking. "Ethan is a good man," he said finally, his voice soft but clear. "I've always known that, even before he came back into our lives." Maya felt her shoulders relax slightly at his words. Stanley continued, "Your mother would have wanted you to be happy, Maya. And if your heart is telling you this is right—" He reached out and patted her hand gently. "Then I support you." Tears of relief rolled down Maya's cheeks. "Really?" "Really," Stanley affirmed. "You deserve someone who sees your strength, your kindness, someone I can trust to take care of you the way you've taken care of me." He squeezed her hand. "And Ethan? Well, I couldn't think of anyone more worthy." Maya leaned forward and hugged her father tightly, feeling the weight of uncertainty lift from her shoulders. As they sat there in the quiet room, Stanley gave her a gentle pat on the back. "Your happiness is all I've ever wanted," he whispered, "and Ethan is a good man, a very good man." Maya smiled through her tears, her heart full of relief and joy. The room fell into a peaceful silence, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. In the morning, in Stanley's living room windows, Ethan settled into the weathered armchair across from Stanley. There was something different in Stanley's demeanor today, a quiet authority that commanded attention despite his physical frailty. His shoulders were set with purpose, his lined face carrying an expression of calm determination. "Ethan," Stanley began, his voice steady and measured, his hands resting carefully on the arms of his chair. "I need to speak with you about something important." Ethan sat up straighter, noting the serious tone and the way Stanley's eyes seemed to hold a particular weight. "Of course, Stanley. What's on your mind?" Stanley's eyes met Ethan's directly, unwavering in their gaze. "I want to know about your feelings toward my daughter." The question caught Ethan off guard, and he felt his heart skip a beat, his throat suddenly dry. He hadn't expected such a direct approach, but as he looked at Stanley's calm expression, he understood this was his chance to be honest. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner seemed to grow louder in the momentary silence. "Maya," Ethan started, then paused to gather his thoughts, his fingers unconsciously smoothing the fabric of his pants. "I care for her deeply, Stanley. I know the situation is complicated, given our history and everything that's happened, but my feelings for her are genuine." Stanley remained silent, his expression encouraging Ethan to continue, the morning light highlighting the silver in his hair. "I've been careful not to overstep any boundaries," Ethan explained, his voice growing more confident with each word. "I wanted to be sure of my feelings before saying anything. She's remarkable. Her strength, her kindness, the way she's dedicated herself to caring for you. It's all shown me what an extraordinary person she is." Stanley nodded slowly, taking in every word, his weathered hands clasped together in contemplation. "I know this might seem unexpected," Ethan continued, leaning forward slightly in his chair, "but my feelings for her have grown naturally over these past weeks. She's become very important to me." Stanley listened intently, his hands folded in his lap, the morning light catching the gold of his wedding ring. When Ethan finished speaking, a warm smile spread across Stanley's face, reaching all the way to his eyes. "Thank you for your honesty, Ethan," Stanley said softly, his voice carrying years of fatherly wisdom. "I can see the sincerity in your words, and I want you to know that you have my blessing." Relief washed over Ethan's face, releasing tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Stanley extended his hand across the space between them, and Ethan reached out to shake it firmly, the gesture carrying the weight of trust and acceptance. "I'm happy for you both," Stanley said, his grip surprisingly strong for someone in his condition. "You're a good man, Ethan. I trust you with my daughter's heart." "Thank you, Stanley," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion, a lump forming in his throat. "That means more to me than you know." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Stanley's living room as he sat in his armchair, watching Maya and Ethan with careful consideration. Golden light filtered through the partially drawn curtains, creating a warm glow that seemed to soften the edges of everything it touched. His fingers drummed lightly on the worn fabric of the armrest before he cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Maya, Ethan," Stanley began, his voice soft but steady, carrying the weight of careful thought. "I've been thinking about your relationship, and there's something I need to say." Maya shifted nervously in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Ethan sat up straighter, his expression attentive and respectful. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking each moment of anticipation. "I believe you two should marry," Stanley said simply, his words hanging in the air like a gentle echo, filling the space between them with possibility. Maya's eyes widened and she glanced quickly at Ethan before looking back at her father, her cheeks flushing pink. "Dad, that's..." she stammered, clearly caught off guard, her voice trembling slightly. Stanley held up his hand, his expression gentle but determined, the same look he'd worn countless times when making important decisions. "I know it might seem too soon, especially with my health being what it is. But Maya, sweetheart, I've watched you carry so much grief, so much responsibility. You need emotional stability, the kind that comes from building a life with someone who truly cares for you, someone who understands what it means to heal." Ethan reached for Maya's hand, squeezing it gently, his thumb brushing soothingly across her knuckles. "We don't have to rush into anything," he assured her, his voice soft and steady. "Whatever pace you're comfortable with. We can take this one day at a time." Maya's eyes glistened with tears as she looked between her father and Ethan, emotion catching in her throat. There's so much uncertainty right now," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "With Dad's health and everything else, and I'm scared. So scared of what comes next." Stanley leaned forward in his chair, his face filled with understanding and fatherly love. "That's exactly why this matters so much to me," he explained, his words careful and measured. "I want to know you'll have someone to lean on, someone who will help you heal, someone who can be there for you when I can't." The room fell silent as Maya processed her father's words, the only sound the steady ticking of the clock and the distant chirping of birds outside. She looked at Ethan, who waited patiently, his expression full of warmth and support, his hand still holding hers. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded slowly, as if coming to terms with a truth she'd known all along. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "If you both think this is right, then yes, I want this too." Stanley smiled faintly, settling back in his chair with visible relief, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Maya turned to Ethan, offering him a tentative smile, though uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. The weight of the decision hung in the air, but there was also a sense of peace, a first step toward something new, something hopeful. The late afternoon light seemed to wrap around them all, binding them together in this moment of change and possibility. The next morning, Maya and Ethan sat at the breakfast table. Steam rose from their coffee cups while they discussed their upcoming wedding plans. Despite the early hour, there was an energy in the air, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. "I was thinking something small," Maya said, stirring her coffee. "Just family and close friends, maybe in the backyard so Dad doesn't have to travel." Ethan nodded, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Whatever makes you comfortable. The important thing is that we're together." Maya squeezed his hand, her eyes softening. "What about after, with Dad's condition?" "We'll handle it together," Ethan assured her. "I've been looking into some treatment options, and there are ways we can make things easier for him while still maintaining our own life." Later that evening after dinner, Maya and Ethan walked hand in hand through the neighborhood. The setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, creating a peaceful backdrop for their conversation. "Sometimes I get so scared," Maya admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Watching Dad get weaker, knowing what's coming, it makes me afraid to love too deeply. I've already lost Mom, and now Dad's illness." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. "I understand that fear, Maya, but you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes. "Having you here, it's made everything feel more manageable somehow, like I can breathe again." "You've been so strong for so long," Ethan said softly, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Let me be strong for you sometimes too." They continued their walk, discussing their hopes for the future, a home together, supporting Stanley through his illness, building a life that honored both their love and their responsibilities. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they made their way back to the house. Standing on the porch, they held hands and looked out at the horizon. The weight of Stanley's illness still hung over them, but there was also a sense of peace in knowing they would face whatever came next as a team. In his office, Ethan sat at his mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of medical files. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds as he methodically went through Stanley's medical history. His trained eyes scanned page after page, looking for patterns or details that might have been overlooked. As he reached for another folder, a yellowed document caught his attention. It was an old family medical record from Stanley's mother. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he read through the details. The symptoms described were eerily familiar, the same neurological condition that Stanley was battling now. "How could we have missed this?" Ethan muttered to himself, running his hand through his hair. The document revealed a painful truth. Stanley's mother had suffered from the same hereditary condition. The progression of her symptoms matched Stanley's almost exactly. Images of the past flickered through Ethan's mind. Stanley's mother in her final years, confined to her bed, her body failing her just as Stanley's was now. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the weight of this discovery settling heavily on his shoulders. Everything made more sense now. Stanley's stubborn resistance to treatment, his acceptance of his fate, his unwillingness to burden others with his condition. He had watched his mother go through the same struggle, knowing that one day it would be his turn. The silence in the office felt oppressive as Ethan processed this information. His medical training told him this was crucial information that could affect their approach to treatment, but his heart ached knowing the burden Stanley had carried alone all these years. With steady hands, Ethan reached for his phone and dialed Maya's number. When she answered, he took a deep breath. "Maya, I need to tell you something important about your father's condition," he began carefully. "I've found some old medical records about your grandmother." He heard Maya's sharp intake of breath as he explained the hereditary nature of Stanley's illness. When he finished, there was a long pause on the line. "All this time," Maya said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "He never said anything." "I think we need to talk to him together," Ethan suggested gently. "This changes how we might approach his treatment." "Yes," Maya agreed. "Thank you, Ethan, for being so thorough, for caring enough to dig deeper." The following morning, Ethan arrived at Stanley's house, his medical bag in hand, and his mind heavy with the knowledge he'd discovered. Maya met him at the door, her eyes reflecting both hope and worry. They found Stanley in his usual spot by the window, lost in thought. "Stanley," Ethan began gently, settling into a chair across from him. "I found something important in your medical history that we need to discuss." Stanley's expression remained unchanged as Ethan explained about the hereditary nature of his condition, laying out the medical facts with careful precision. Maya sat beside her father, her hand finding his as she listened. After Ethan finished speaking, silence filled the room. Stanley stared out the window, his shoulders tense. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've known for years," he admitted. "Watched my mother go through the same thing. I knew it would come for me too." Maya's grip on her father's hand tightened. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" "What good would it have done?" Stanley's voice cracked slightly. "Some things you can't fight. Some battles you're meant to lose." "That's not true," Ethan interjected firmly. "Yes, the condition is serious, but we have treatment options. We can slow the progression, improve your quality of life. Medical science has advanced significantly since your mother's time." Maya leaned forward, her eyes bright with tears. "Please, Dad, don't give up. Not when we can help you. I need you to fight this, not just for yourself, but for me too." Stanley's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "Maya, you're not alone in this," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You have me. You have Ethan. We're here to help you through this." Stanley closed his eyes, his weathered hands trembling slightly. The weight of his secret, carried for so many years, seemed to press down on his shoulders. When he opened his eyes again, they were filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. After what seemed like an eternity, Stanley nodded slowly. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll try the treatment again." He looked between Maya and Ethan, his expression a complex blend of gratitude and acceptance. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider what the future might hold, not just for himself, but for all of them. And the early morning light filtered through Stanley's bedroom window as Ethan arrived for his daily checkup, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. Something was different today. Stanley seemed more exhausted than usual, his movements slower and more labored, his skin taking on an ashen pallor that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Ethan's practiced hands moved methodically through the examination, checking vital signs and monitoring responses, but his growing concern became harder to mask with each passing moment, his professional facade cracking slightly at the edges. Stanley's pulse was weaker than it should have been, fluttering like a trapped bird beneath Ethan's fingertips. His reflexes had deteriorated significantly since the last examination, barely responding to the gentle taps of the reflex hammer. Ethan made careful notes in his medical journal, his pen pressing perhaps a bit too hard against the paper, leaving deep indentations on the pages below. Later that afternoon, they sat together in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken worries. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor and illuminating the dust motes that danced between them. Ethan held Stanley's latest test results in his hands, his fingers tight against the papers, crinkling their edges. The numbers and data told a story he didn't want to read. The treatment wasn't working. The disease was progressing faster than anyone had anticipated, destroying hopes and plans with brutal efficiency. "What is it, Ethan?" Stanley's voice was quiet but steady, his eyes fixed on Ethan's face. "I can see it in your face. You've never been good at hiding bad news." Ethan took a deep breath, struggling to maintain his professional composure as memories of their shared past threatened to overwhelm him. "The treatment, it's not having the effect we hoped for." He paused, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air between them. "The condition is progressing more rapidly than we expected. The latest readings show significant deterioration." Stanley nodded slowly, his expression unchanged, hands folded calmly in his lap. He didn't seem surprised by the news, as if he had somehow known all along, had felt it in his bones. The silence between them grew thick with unspoken fears and realizations, broken only by the steady ticking of the wall clock. "I see," Stanley finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze drifting to the family photo on the side table. Ethan leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on an urgent tone, fighting against the hopelessness that threatened to engulf them both. "We can try adjusting the medication, explore other options." But the words felt hollow, even to him. They both knew what this meant, what future lay ahead. The afternoon light began to fade as Ethan prepared to leave, gathering his belongings with hands that trembled slightly. He stood in Stanley's doorway, looking back at the man who sat quietly in his chair, lost in thought, bathed in the golden glow of sunset. The promise to keep fighting rose to his lips, even as the feeling of helplessness threatened to overwhelm him. With a soft click, he closed the door, leaving Stanley alone with his thoughts and the lengthening shadows of evening. In the evening, Maya and Ethan sat together on the couch, their hands intertwined. Stanley shifted in his armchair, his movements slower and more deliberate than usual. He cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "I need to talk to you both about something important," Stanley said, his voice carrying a weight that made Maya sit up straighter. "I want you to get married as soon as possible, while I'm still here to see it." Maya's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Ethan, then back at her father. "Dad, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that time isn't on our side anymore." Stanley's words were gentle but firm. "I want to be there when you say your vows. I want to see you happy and settled before—" He didn't finish the sentence. Maya's eyes filled with tears. "But Dad, there's so much to plan, to organize." "It doesn't need to be elaborate," Stanley interrupted. "Just something simple with family. What matters is that it happens soon." The room fell silent as Maya struggled with her emotions. Ethan squeezed her hand gently, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Maya," Stanley continued, leaning forward in his chair, "I need to know you'll be taken care of. That you'll have someone to lean on when—" His voice cracked slightly. Maya felt torn between her father's wishes and her own feelings about rushing such an important step. Her heart ached seeing the urgency in her father's eyes, understanding the underlying reason for his request. "We could keep it small," Ethan said softly, looking at Maya. "Just immediate family. Whatever makes you comfortable." Maya wiped away a tear with her free hand. "You'd be okay with that?" Ethan nodded. "We can take everything else one step at a time. What matters is that we're together and that your father can be there." After a long moment, Maya nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it." Stanley's face lit up with joy, though his eyes held a hint of sadness. "Thank you," he said quietly. "This means everything to me." They spent the next hour discussing simple arrangements, their voices mixing with the fading daylight. The conversation was punctuated by moments of both laughter and held-back tears as they planned a ceremony that would take place within days. As evening settled in, Maya and Ethan sat together in comfortable silence, processing the decision they'd made. Ethan reached over and took Maya's hand again, offering silent support. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the complex mix of emotions washing over her. Love for both her father and Ethan, grief for what was coming, and hope for what lay ahead. The living room was bathed in soft lamplight as Stanley sat in his favorite chair, his breathing slightly labored but his eyes clear and focused. He gestured for Ethan and Maya to join him, his movements slower than usual but deliberate. "There's something I need to tell you both," Stanley said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something about your mother, Maya, and a dream she never got to see through." Maya leaned forward, her hand finding her father's. Stanley's eyes grew distant as he remembered. "Before the bombing, Anne was working on creating a safe haven," he continued. "A place where families torn apart by war could find shelter, medical care, and hope." His voice grew stronger as he spoke about the past, as if drawing energy from the memories themselves. The room seemed to shift as Stanley described their earlier years together. He and Anne, young and determined, working side by side in refugee camps, dreaming of building something permanent, something that would last beyond their own lifetimes. She had everything planned out, Stanley said, pulling a worn folder from beside his chair. Inside were detailed drawings and plans, written in Anne's neat handwriting. Education programs, medical facilities, sustainable farming initiatives. She believed we could create a place where people could rebuild their lives. Maya's eyes filled with tears as she looked through her mother's work. Each page revealed another piece of Anne's vision, another fragment of the dream that had died with her. "This was her legacy," Stanley said softly, "and I've carried it with me all these years, unable to fulfill it on my own. But now," he looked at Ethan and Maya with pleading eyes, "now I need you both to see it through." Ethan studied the plans carefully, his medical training allowing him to understand the scope of what Anne had envisioned. "The medical facilities alone could help thousands," he said quietly. "Mom really planned all this?" Maya asked, her voice trembling as she traced her mother's handwriting. Stanley nodded. Every detail. She believed that healing wasn't just about medicine, it was about giving people a chance to start over. His hands shook slightly as he arranged the papers. "I need to know that her dream won't die with me, that something good will come from all this loss." Maya wiped away tears as she looked at her father. "We'll do it, Dad. We'll make sure Mom's project becomes reality." Ethan placed his hand over theirs. "I promise we'll see it through, Stanley. Every detail, just as Anne planned it." The room fell quiet as Stanley closed his eyes, relief washing over his face. His daughter and the man who would soon be his son-in-law sat with him in the growing darkness, united by a promise that would change not only their lives but the lives of countless others. The next morning, Ethan and Maya sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by Anne's papers and documents. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she sorted through her mother's meticulous notes, while Ethan made calls to his financial advisor. "I can allocate a significant portion of my savings to get this started," Ethan said, putting down his phone. "We'll need more support, but it's a solid foundation." Maya looked up from the papers, her eyes bright with determination. Mom had already identified several potential partner organizations. Some of these contacts might still be active. They spent the morning reaching out to various humanitarian organizations, government officials, and private donors. Some calls went straight to voicemail, while others led to promising conversations. Ethan's reputation as a successful neurologist opened several doors, and Maya's passionate presentation of her mother's vision helped keep them open. At the local humanitarian aid office, Maya spread out the blueprints on a conference table. "The center will provide medical care, education, and vocational training," she explained to the committee members. "My mother designed it to be self-sustaining within 5 years." Ethan stood beside her, adding his medical expertise to the presentation. "The healthcare facility alone could serve thousands annually," he noted, pointing to the detailed plans. Not everyone was convinced. Some organizations questioned the scale of the project, while others worried about long-term sustainability. But Maya and Ethan persisted, drawing strength from each other's determination. Later that afternoon, they visited the proposed site, a large plot of empty land on the outskirts of the city. Maya stood in silence, taking in the barren landscape. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "It's perfect," Maya whispered. "Mom would have loved it here." Construction crews arrived to begin preliminary surveys. The sound of machinery filled the air as workers took soil samples and marked boundaries. Maya watched them work, her mother's folder clutched tightly to her chest. Ethan handled the practical aspects, signing contracts, reviewing budgets, and coordinating with contractors. His calm efficiency complemented Maya's emotional drive, creating a balance that helped push the project forward. As the sun began to set, Maya and Ethan stood at the edge of the property. Workers packed up their equipment for the day, leaving behind marker flags and survey stakes that dotted the landscape. The first tangible signs of progress. "We're really doing this," Maya said softly, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Ethan nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "Your mother's dream is becoming reality." He looked out at the marked-out foundations where buildings would soon rise. and your father will see it happen." Many days later, the construction site buzzed with activity as workers put the finishing touches on the humanitarian center. Trucks moved back and forth, carrying supplies and equipment, while teams of laborers worked diligently on the final details of the buildings. The air was filled with the steady hum of machinery and occasional shouts of foremen directing their crews. Ethan and Maya walked through the organized chaos, their faces showing both exhaustion and pride in every step they took. "I can't believe how much progress we've made," Maya said, looking up at the main building's facade. The medical wing stood complete, its windows gleaming in the morning sun, while the education center's classrooms were being furnished with desks, chairs, and educational supplies. The fresh paint gave off a clean, hopeful scent that seemed to embody their mission. In their temporary office, Maya sat at her desk, surrounded by blueprints, schedules, and stacks of contractor invoices. She traced her finger along the project plans, remembering how these were once just sketches in her mother's notebook, filled with margin notes and dreams for the future. "It's strange," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first, I was doing this for Mom. But somewhere along the way, it became my mission too. Every decision feels like it matters so much more now." Ethan looked up from his laptop where he'd been reviewing the final budget reports and donor contributions. "Your mother would be proud of how you've brought her vision to life. And Stanley..." He paused, his voice thick with emotion, remembering his friend's final days. Stanley got to see the foundation being laid. He knew it would succeed. He never doubted you for a moment. Maya nodded, wiping away a tear with the back of her hand. "Even when Dad's gone, this place will stand as a testament to both of them, to their love for helping others, to everything they believed in." They walked the grounds together, inspecting the nearly completed facilities. The community center bustled with workers installing the last of the equipment, from medical devices to computer systems. Near the main entrance, a bronze plaque caught the afternoon sun, its polished surface gleaming. Maya stopped to read the inscription: "The Ann Walker Memorial Humanitarian Center, where hope finds a home." "This will change so many lives," Ethan said, his voice filled with quiet pride and wonder. "Every person who walks through these doors will carry forward your parents' legacy. They'll touch countless lives, just like your parents did." Maya squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of his support. "Our legacy now. I couldn't have done this without you, Ethan. You've been my rock through all of this." As the sun began to set, they stood together at the edge of the property, watching the day's work wind down. The site grew quiet, with only the occasional echo of distant voices and equipment being stored away. The golden light painted the buildings in warm hues, making the whole project glow like a beacon of hope against the darkening sky. Maya leaned against Ethan, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew, without a single doubt, that Stanley would be proud of what they had accomplished together, of how they had transformed his and Anne's dream into reality. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Stanley's bedroom, casting a gentle glow across the quiet space. The light caught dust motes dancing in the air, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed fitting for this solemn moment. Stanley lay in his bed, his breathing shallow but steady, while Maya sat beside him, her hand wrapped tenderly around his. From the doorway, Ethan watched silently, his presence offering quiet support, his medical bag set carefully on a nearby chair. Though physically weak, Stanley's eyes held a clear, peaceful light. "The center," he whispered, his voice soft but steady, like autumn leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. "I can see it in my mind. It's beautiful." A faint smile crossed his face as he squeezed Maya's hand, his fingers still showing surprising strength. "You've both done so much," he continued, looking between Maya and Ethan, his gaze full of warmth and gratitude. "Anne would be proud. I'm proud." His mind drifted to memories of the past. Sunny afternoons spent with Anne planning their humanitarian missions, the joy in her eyes when they helped those in need. He remembered their shared dreams, the countless nights spent discussing ways to make the world better, cups of tea growing cold as they lost track of time in their planning. The images flooded his consciousness. Anne's determined expression as she sketched out plans for the center, her unwavering belief that they could make a difference, the way she'd push her reading glasses up her nose when deep in concentration. Maya. Stanley's voice grew softer, but his words remained clear, each one carefully chosen. You've become everything I hoped you would be. Strong, compassionate, capable. He paused, gathering his strength, his chest rising and falling with the effort. Don't stop living because I'm gone. Your mother and I, we've left you a legacy, but it's yours now. Make it grow. His gaze shifted to Ethan, standing quietly in the doorway, his doctor's composure barely masking his emotional investment in this moment. Take care of her, he whispered. She'll need someone to lean on. The room fell silent except for Stanley's increasingly shallow breathing. Maya held his hand tighter, tears rolling down her cheeks and falling onto their clasped hands. With one final, peaceful sigh, Stanley's eyes closed and his hand went limp in Maya's grasp, like a bird finally finding rest. Maya continued holding his hand, unwilling to let go just yet, her thumb unconsciously stroking his cooling skin. The morning light seemed to pause, suspended in the stillness of the room, creating long shadows that stretched across the floor. Finally, she gently placed his hand on his chest, her tears falling freely now, dotting the bedsheet like morning dew. She turned to look at Ethan, her eyes filled with both grief and gratitude, seeking anchor in the storm of emotions. Ethan stepped forward, his own eyes glistening, and wrapped his arms around her in a comforting embrace. Together they sat in the quiet room, honoring the man who had brought them together and left behind a legacy of love and service, while outside the window, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak tree Stanley had planted decades ago. The small chapel was filled with soft morning light filtering through stained glass windows. Friends and family sat in polished wooden pews, their faces reflecting both sorrow and love as they gathered to remember Stanley. The air held a solemn warmth, heavy with memories and unspoken gratitude. Ethan stood at the podium, his fingers gripping its edges slightly. Though his hands trembled, his voice remained steady as he began to speak. Stanley wasn't just the man who saved my life, he said, his words echoing through the quiet chapel. He was the man who showed me what it means to live fully, to serve others without hesitation, and to love unconditionally. Looking out at the gathered mourners, Ethan continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. 20 years ago, in a war-torn village, Stanley didn't just patch up my wounds. He showed me what true courage looks like. He taught me that one person's kindness can change the course of another's life completely. Tears welled in his eyes as he spoke about Stanley's dedication to humanitarian work, his deep love for his family, and his unwavering commitment to making the world better. Every life Stanley touched was made richer for knowing him. He never sought recognition or praise. He simply did what was right, what was needed, regardless of the cost to himself. In the front row, Maya sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched Ethan speak, her eyes filled with both pride and sadness as he shared stories of her father's impact on his life. Around her, sniffles and quiet sobs punctuated the air as Ethan's words touched the hearts of those gathered. Stanley's legacy isn't just in the lives he saved or the projects he completed. Ethan's voice cracked slightly. It's in the way he inspired others to be better, to do more, to love deeper. His spirit lives on in every act of kindness, every moment of selfless service. As the service concluded, people began to file out of the chapel, many wiping tears from their eyes. Outside, beneath a gentle sky, Ethan found Maya standing alone. He approached quietly, placing his arm around her shoulders. They stood together in silence, sharing the weight of loss and the comfort of each other's presence. No words were needed in that moment. They both understood that while Stanley was gone, his legacy would continue through them. Several weeks after Stanley's funeral, Maya and Ethan sat together in the garden, the gentle breeze carrying the sounds of activity from the nearby project site. The morning sun warmed their faces as they watched people coming and going from the newly constructed buildings, their shadows dancing across the freshly laid pathways. "It feels different now," Maya said softly, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, steam rising in delicate wisps. "Like Dad's at peace, and somehow I am too. The weight I carried for so long, it's lighter." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. His fingers absently traced patterns on the wooden bench they shared. "Working on this project has changed everything for me. Your father taught me more about being a doctor and a person than years of medical school ever did. He showed me what true healing means." They stood up and walked toward the project site, their footsteps falling in sync on the gravel path. The main building buzzed with activity. Children's laughter echoed from classrooms while families waited patiently in the medical wing, sharing quiet conversations and warm smiles. Through the windows, they could see teachers engaged with students and medical staff attending to patients with the same compassionate approach Stanley had always championed. "Look at all of this," Maya gestured to the thriving community center, her voice filled with wonder. "Mom's dream, Dad's legacy, it's all here living and breathing. Every corner holds a piece of their vision." Ethan squeezed her hand, his touch gentle but reassuring. "We need to keep building on what they started. This can't be the end. It should be just the beginning. There's so much more we can do." They walked through the corridors, stopping to watch a group of children learning to read, their small faces bright with concentration. Maya's eyes brightened as she spoke, her voice growing animated. "We could expand the educational programs, maybe add more medical services. Create something even bigger than what we imagined. We could open similar centers in other communities," Ethan added, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Your father's approach to humanitarian work, it deserves to be replicated. His methods of combining healthcare with education and community support, it's revolutionary." They made their way outside as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the grounds. The newly planted gardens were beginning to bloom, adding spots of color to the landscape. Purple coneflowers, yellow black-eyed Susans, and bright red salvias dotted the beds. Hand in hand, they stood watching the day's activities wind down, their shared sense of purpose stronger than ever. "Dad would have loved seeing this," Maya said, leaning slightly against Ethan's shoulder, drawing comfort from his presence. Ethan looked out at the thriving community center, remembering Stanley's final days and the peace he'd found in knowing his wife's dream would live on. Together, they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, their hearts full of gratitude for the legacy they now shared and the future they would build together. If you enjoyed the story of Stanley and Ethan, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.